Good afternoon, church. I just wanted to pop in today and send some encouragement to you. Hope that you had a good Sunday worshiping in your home with those who you're closest to. Thank you for choosing to tune in this afternoon. I thought since we were finished with our reading from last week, we would enter into a different kind of devotional study this week. I want to do something kind of simple considering what time of year it is. This is what's traditionally called Passion Week. This is, of course, the last week of Jesus' earthly life. That began on Sunday, yesterday, which was Palm Sunday, and it's going to culminate in Easter Sunday. So I want to take a look at this week from the Scriptures and kind of go day by day just to look and try to follow the steps of Jesus and see where he was on each day of his last week before we get to Friday and, of course, Easter Sunday. I'm using a book called The Agony and Glory of the Cross by Charles B. Hodge. There are a ton of resources where you can find this information. I'm not reinventing the wheel. It's just simply using this book as a guide to help us go through and look at what scriptures apply to which day. But any good study Bible that you've got should have that information about the chronology of Jesus's final week. Of course, yesterday we spoke about Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem and riding on a donkey. That would be a day of acclaim. There was much acclaim and popularity over Jesus and over the way he chose to ride into the city of Jerusalem. Today is Monday of Jesus' Passion Week, and this is what's called a day of authority. So first we had a day of acclaim where Jesus rode into the city. Today is a day of authority. I especially love the way Mark composes his gospel overall, and especially the way he treats the last week of Jesus' life. I'm going to stick with Mark today. I don't know if we'll stick with Mark for the rest of the week, but there's a good chance we will, just because I love the way Mark lays out his gospel. And so if you have your Bibles and want to take just a moment to turn there with us, turn to Mark chapter 11. And so the first thing Jesus did is, after he had his moment of acclaim, after he made his entrance into the city, he chose to display the authority that he had over the world and over this life. And of course, the first thing he did was he cursed a fig tree. As we'll say in just a moment, this was a living parable that was meant to teach a lesson to those who were watching. In Mark chapter 11, begin reading with me in verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." So Jesus, leaving the city of Jerusalem and going from Bethany, they came upon a fig tree, and Jesus found himself very hungry, and so he came up to a fig tree, which was in leaf. Mark gives us that detail, but there's no figs on it. There's no figs on this fig tree that has already produced leaves after the winter. Mark also includes this little detail, that it is not the season for figs. We're just not in season yet. It's not the time for the fig tree to be bearing fruit. But Jesus goes ahead anyway and curses this fig tree and just really speaks maybe a little unkindly to it in our vernacular. May no one ever take fruit from you again. That seems kind of harsh, but I think Jesus is up to something. Jesus then leaves that fig tree and he cursed the fig tree, and then he goes to, if we want to say, cleanse the temple. He has this temple cleansing beginning in Mark chapter 11, verse 15. They came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. But you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. And so Jesus goes into the temple, and he begins to have this temple cleansing. Jesus enters the temple, and he sees the money changers who are changing currencies around for all the people who visited from all around the area. There are people selling animals to be used for sacrifice. Of course, there's a trade rate that there is. There's a foreign rate that people are being upcharged for in these sacrifices. There's a tax when you go to have your currency changed over. And Jesus looked around at all this, and he really saw that the temple resembled more like more of a flea market than a house of worship. This really unnerves Jesus, and Jesus becomes angry. This is one of the times where he just absolutely becomes very angry. And I love what Mark says here in verse 17. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? And what Jesus seems to be indicating is that these evil practices, the unfair changing of the money or turning over of the sacrifices, is really serving to turn people away. People in general are turned off by that. Instead, the temple should be a symbol of God's care for all people, for all the nations. All people ought to feel like they can come to God and lay down their burdens and give sacrifice. This is supposed to be a house of prayer for the nations, not just the Jewish nation, but Jesus says for all the nations. And so when they see this, the chief priests and the scribes, they begin to make a final push and a plan to put Jesus to death. This is Monday of the week that he will be crucified, and they really seriously begin to plan his death. This is why I love Mark, because Jesus was just at the fig tree, he enters the temple, and then Mark has us going back to the fig tree. I love this scene because it's like we're being served up a sandwich. You know, we've got the fig tree and the temple, and now on the bottom slice of bread is another fig tree story. Look with me at verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And so it had withered up after Jesus cursed it. Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And so on the way out, the disciples and Jesus passed by the same fig tree, the very one that Jesus had cursed, and found that it had withered away. And Peter's kind of surprised. And Mark includes this interpolation here. And I think what he means by doing this, by having the temple scene in between two fig tree scenes, is to say that there is a connection between what happened at the fig tree and what has been happening at the temple. There's a special connection in these two stories. I think what Jesus is telling his disciples, he's speaking to the condition of our lives if we don't have faith and prayer. If we are a faithless generation, if we are a faithless people, then this is the condition of our lives. We really can just wither up spiritually. Listen to the words Jesus uses. I'm beginning in verse 22. Jesus tells his disciples, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, that you have received it, and it will be yours. So the temple was supposed to be what? A house of prayer. And now Jesus begins instructing his disciples about their prayer life. Verse 25, and whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. And so Jesus shows visibly what happened to the fig tree and how it withered away, but in a spiritual sense, that's what has happened to the Jerusalem temple. Faithfully, it had withered away to nothing. The temple servers were concerned with what they could make. They were concerned with making bank. They were really concerned with their own selves. And so spiritually, they had withered. They'd failed to live out God's purpose. And that's the teaching that we have about Jesus on Monday of his final week. And so I want to leave you with this, just to kind of help us guide through this day. On the episode of the fig tree, what is it a fig tree should be known for? Bearing figs. A fig tree ought to be known by its fruit. But this fig tree had no fruit. What should the temple be known for? Being a house of prayer, being a house of prayer for, Jesus says, for the nations. What about us? What should a Christian be known for?